My name is Jake, and I'm 18 years old. This is a story I've never shared with anyone before. Even now, just thinking about it makes my heart pound in my chest. It was an experience that changed my life forever, one I never saw coming. It all started about 6 months ago when something completely unexpected turned my world upside down. My life had been simple, predictable even, until that moment. But when disaster struck, everything I knew was suddenly taken away, forcing me into a situation I never imagined I'd be in. The disaster came in the form of a flood. It wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a full-scale catastrophe that left our home unlivable. My father and I had spent years in that house, building memories, creating a life within those walls, and in a matter of hours, it was all destroyed. Water poured in relentlessly, soaking everything we owned, reducing our belongings to nothing more than ruined fragments of the past. The damage was overwhelming, and there was no quick fix. We had no choice but to leave, but the problem was we had nowhere to go. The reality of being displaced hit hard. We scrambled for options, trying to figure out where we could stay, how we would rebuild, how long it would take before life felt normal again. Just when it seemed like we were out of luck, my dad's old friend Mark stepped in to save us. Mark had always been more of a name than a person in my life, someone I knew existed but had never really interacted with. My dad would mention him occasionally, usually in passing during casual conversations or when reminiscing about the past. From what little I had gathered, Mark was successful, lived in a high-end apartment across town, and had a life that seemed to be effortlessly put together. Unlike us, who were suddenly homeless and lost, Mark had everything under control. When my father reached out to him, I didn't expect much. But to my surprise, Mark didn't even hesitate. He immediately offered us a place to stay, assuring my dad that there was more than enough room and that it wouldn't be any trouble at all. My dad, exhausted and desperate for a solution, accepted the offer without question. And just like that, we packed up whatever we could salvage and left what was left of our home behind. We drove through the night to get there, my dad behind the wheel, while I sat in the passenger seat, trying to process everything that had happened. My mind was a mess of emotions, grief, exhaustion, uncertainty. I barely noticed the hours passing until we finally pulled up outside Mark's building. The moment we arrived, everything felt different. Mark greeted us at the door, his presence immediately commanding attention. He had this energy about him, calm, confident, welcoming. His smile was warm, his words reassuring, and despite my exhaustion, I felt strangely at ease in his presence. Stepping into his apartment was like stepping into another world. It was massive, sleek, and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the glow of the city lights. Every inch of the space was pristine, decorated with an effortless sense of style. It felt less like a home and more like something out of a luxury magazine. Compared to our old lived-in house, this place felt surreal. As we settled in, I learned more about Mark. He was 35, a successful architect, and lived alone. He was also openly gay, something I hadn't thought much about before. My dad and Mark had been close for years, and their friendship seemed unshaken by time. While I didn't fully understand the dynamics of their relationship, it was clear that Mark was someone my dad trusted deeply. The first few days in Mark's apartment were an adjustment, living out of boxes, trying to adapt to a new environment, feeling like guests in someone else's space. It wasn't easy, but Mark did everything he could to make us feel comfortable. He was always checking in, making sure we had what we needed, going out of his way to help in ways that felt natural rather than obligatory. His kindness was effortless, and that was what made it so disarming. But the thing that stood out the most wasn't just his generosity. It was the way he treated me. At first it was subtle, a touch on my shoulder that lingered just a second too long, a brush of his hand when he passed by, a gaze that felt too intense to be casual. These moments were fleeting, but they carried an unspoken weight. At first I brushed them off as nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as time passed, I realized it wasn't just in my head. There was something there. One particular afternoon, when my dad was out running errands, I was sprawled out on the couch, half watching TV, lost in thought. The apartment was quiet except for the distant hum of the city outside. Then Mark walked in. He didn't just sit down. He positioned himself close to me, close enough that I could feel his presence, the warmth of his body radiating next to mine. His hand rested just behind my shoulder, the slightest touch that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't accidental. I knew that. And in that moment, I knew he knew it too. He asked me how I was adjusting, but his voice was quieter than usual, softer. I tried to answer, but my thoughts were scrambled. My heart was racing, and I wasn't sure why. Or maybe I was, and I just didn't want to admit it to myself. There was something about Mark that drew me in. Something that made me nervous, but also left me wanting more. It was unfamiliar territory, a feeling I didn't quite understand. But as the days passed, that feeling only grew stronger. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I didn't know what was happening between us, or even if anything was really happening at all. But what I did know was that every time Mark looked at me, every time he touched me, it felt like something was shifting inside me, something I wasn't ready to face yet, and that was just the beginning. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get him out of my head. Mark was everywhere, in my thoughts, in my dreams, in the way my heart raced every time he entered the room. It was more than just admiration. It was something deeper, something unshakable. His voice, the effortless way he carried himself, the way his presence filled a space, it all consumed me. I found myself drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain, couldn't control. My mind would wander, imagining scenarios I never would have dared to before. What would it feel like to be close to him? To have him look at me in a way that meant something more? It was dangerous to think this way, but the thoughts wouldn't stop coming. And then, one morning, everything shifted. My dad had left for a business trip, meaning it was just me and Mark in the apartment. The moment I woke up, the place felt different, quieter, heavier, like something unseen was lingering in the air. I stretched, still half asleep, and decided to take a shower to shake off the drowsiness. The hallway was silent as I made my way toward the bathroom, my mind clouded with the haze of early morning thoughts. But the second I opened the door, the world around me seemed to freeze. Mark was standing there, steam rising around him, the soft morning light filtering through the fogged-up mirror. My breath hitched. He hadn't noticed me yet. His back was to me, his broad shoulders flexing slightly as he ran a towel through his damp hair. Water droplets traced slow paths down his skin, catching the light in a way that made it impossible to look away. I should have turned around. I should have said something. But I didn't. For a moment, I just stood there, captivated, my pulse hammering in my ears. My mouth was dry and my chest felt tight, like my body wasn't sure whether to panic or surrender to whatever this was. It was the first time I had ever truly seen him, not just as my dad's friend, not just as the man who had taken us in, but as something else, as someone I wanted. The moment shattered as soon as he turned his head. His eyes met mine in the mirror, and everything inside me jolted back to reality. Heat rushed to my face, and I scrambled backward, mumbling a barely coherent apology before slamming the door shut behind me. I practically ran back to my room, my heart thundering against my ribs. My hands were shaking as I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to catch my breath. What had just happened? More importantly, why did I feel like this? I told myself it was just embarrassment, just an accident. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true, because I wasn't just flustered. I was turned on. The image of him lingered in my mind, no matter how much I tried to push it away. Every detail, the way the water had clung to his skin, the way his muscles moved so effortlessly, the way his eyes had locked onto mine for that split second, was burned into my memory. And the more I thought about it, the worse it got. I laid back, staring at the ceiling, my whole body tense. It felt like something inside me had awakened, something that had been simmering beneath the surface, but had finally come to light. And now I couldn't put it back. I didn't know what to do with these feelings. But one thing was clear, this was only the beginning. Waking up the next day felt surreal, like I was still caught between a dream and reality. The weight of the previous morning still pressed down on me, making it hard to focus on anything else. The memory played over and over in my head like a song stuck on repeat. I kept telling myself to move on, to act normal. My dad was coming back soon. I couldn't let him suspect anything, but pretending nothing had changed was easier said than done. When I finally made my way downstairs, Mark was already in the kitchen, casually flipping through a newspaper like nothing had happened. But the moment his eyes met mine, something passed between us, something unspoken, electric. It was only for a second, but it sent a wave of heat through me. Then, just as quickly, he smirked. A small knowing smile, subtle, effortless. But it said everything. My stomach flipped, and I had to force myself to keep moving, pretending I hadn't noticed. I grabbed a glass of water, trying to steady my hands. The air between us was different now. Every glance, every moment we shared in the same room felt heavier, like something was teetering on the edge of happening, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold it together. Mark, on the other hand, seemed perfectly at ease. He moved around the kitchen with the same confidence he always had, talking casually, his voice smooth and unbothered. But there was something in the way he looked at me, subtle, restrained, but undeniably there. Was I imagining it? Was I reading too much into things? Or did he feel it too? I was on edge the entire morning, barely able to keep my thoughts straight. Every time he moved near me, I felt hyper-aware of his presence. My body reacted before my mind could even process it. A brush of his arm, the way he leaned just a little too close. It sent my nerves into overdrive. Then, just before noon, my dad's car pulled into the driveway. The moment reality came crashing back, I realized how dangerous this was. I couldn't let my dad notice anything. I had to act normal. But how could I when I felt like everything inside me had shifted? Mark greeted my dad like nothing had changed. Smiling, joking, completely in control. Watching him, I realized he was better at hiding things than I was. Meanwhile, I felt like I was seconds away from unraveling. That night, lying in bed, I replayed every moment over and over again. The tension, the way his gaze lingered, the feeling of being pulled towards something I didn't understand. This wasn't just some passing thought. It wasn't just curiosity. It was real. And I had no idea where it was going to lead. After dinner, I went upstairs to my room, needing space to clear my head. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that something was about to happen. Something that would change everything. My heart was racing, my hands trembling slightly as I sat on the edge of my bed. Every thought in my mind led back to Mark, his voice, his presence, the way he looked at me. It was consuming me whole. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling shakily. This is dangerous. This is wrong. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself to stop thinking about it, my heart refused to listen. And then a knock on the door. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't need to ask who it was. I already knew. Jake? His voice was quiet but firm. It's me. Can I come in? My pulse hammered against my rib cage. My fingers gripped the sheets for a moment, as if grounding myself, but before I could second guess it, my feet moved on their own. I opened the door. Mark stood there, watching me with those dark, unreadable eyes, the kind of gaze that could cut through every wall I had built. He didn't say anything at first, but he didn't have to. The air between us was thick with something electric, something neither of us had the strength to ignore anymore. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. My room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. He lifted a hand, brushing his fingers along my jaw, tilting my chin up. His touch was warm, steady, like an unspoken promise. I can't stop thinking about you, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. His thumb grazed my cheek, sending a shiver down my spine. I've tried, I really have. I swallowed hard, my breath uneven. Me too, I confessed. It was the truth, and we both knew it. That was all it took. In the next moment, he closed the space between us, his lips pressing against mine with an intensity that sent my mind spiraling. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a collision, like we had been holding back for far too long, and now there was no stopping it. His hands tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, deepening the kiss as heat spread through my entire body. I could feel the urgency behind his touch, the quiet desperation in the way he held me, like he had been waiting for this just as long as I had. Everything else faded away. Nothing else existed. Just this. Just him. We moved in sync, every touch, every stolen breath drawing us deeper into something neither of us could put into words. There was a hunger there, a need that had been buried for too long. His lips moved against mine like he was memorizing the shape of them, like he wanted to make sure I'd never forget, and I knew I wouldn't. We stayed tangled together for what felt like forever, lost in the moment, neither of us wanting to break it. But eventually reality crept back in. The weight of what we had just done, the risks, the consequences, it all settled in the silence that followed. Mark exhaled, his forehead resting against mine. "This is dangerous," he murmured, but he didn't pull away. I closed my eyes. I know. Neither of us wanted to stop, but we both knew that the world outside this room was waiting, and it wouldn't be as forgiving as the four walls that had just held our secret. The following days blurred together, a whirlwind of emotions, stolen glances, and unspoken words. My father was in and out of town, leaving Mark and me alone more often than not. Every moment we had to ourselves was charged with something unspoken, something waiting to explode all over again. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't last. My dad wasn't oblivious. He started noticing the way I acted, the way Mark and I moved around each other. It wasn't obvious, at least I hoped it wasn't, but something in his expression told me he was picking up on something. He didn't say anything right away, but I could feel the shift in the air. Then, one evening, he sat me down at the kitchen table. "I think it's time we move out," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Mark has done more than enough for us, and I don't want to impose any longer." I felt my stomach drop. Leave? Just like that? I tried to mask the panic rising in my chest, but I knew my expression had faltered for just a second. My father didn't seem to notice. He was too preoccupied with his own thoughts. But Mark? Mark noticed. He didn't say anything, but when our eyes met across the room, I saw it. That same feeling reflected back at me, the silent acknowledgement that this wasn't over. We packed our bags, and just like that, it was time to leave. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like I had just been ripped away from something I wasn't ready to lose. My body ached with the memory of him, my skin still buzzing from every touch, every whispered word. This wasn't the end. I knew it wasn't. Because no matter how much distance was put between us, no matter how long we were apart, when we saw each other again, I knew exactly how it would go. Like we had never left at all, and I would be counting down the days until then.